Bill Griffin. Welcome to Different Take Podcast. If you like this content, please subscribe, like, share, comment. Really appreciate you watching. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Peter Smargorinsky, who is a retired University of Georgia professor, was a former English teacher in Chicago, and has been resident of Athens for 25 years now. And is there anything you'd like to add to that?
No, well, I guess it would help if people knew that I was, my university career was in teacher education, but also literacy education, broadly speaking, building on my high school teaching experience as an English teacher. That's been where my research interests lie, but they're actually broader than that. And for the kind of writing that we're going to talk about, it doesn't really come out of my my research program, but it's more my observations as a concerned citizen with a little knowledge of schools and teachers and kids.
So, and I really appreciate you doing this. What prompted me to reach out to you was you'd written a column that was published in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. It's titled "Starting Small Might Aid Gwinnett's School Discipline Shift." And so this was published November 30th, 2022, and it's December 5th today. So just let people know what the time frame is if you want to look that up. But so the thing that I found interesting about this was a different question. I won't say bigger question, but a different question is, it seems to me what society in general and parents specifically will either tolerate or demand in terms of the code of conduct in schools.
Mm-hmm.
So what do you think about that?
Well, to back up a little of why I would write an article for the Atlanta paper on a county discipline issue that is a place where I don't even live. It's Gwinnett County, Georgia is actually an immense county. And one of the points I made in the paper was that there are more kids enrolled in Gwinnett County schools than there are in the state of Rhode Island. I mean, this is a big school system. And by and large, I think that big school systems are unmanageable. They're just too big and diffuse, but that's a whole separate question. But the newspaper had news stories about all this commotion in Gwinnett County over how to deal with unruly kids. And there had been two contrary essays published in Maureen Downey's Get Schooled blog. One was of a parent who said, we need to punish kids, we need law and order, the kids are out of control, we need tougher discipline policies, get the disruptive kids out of classrooms, which is a very familiar line of reasoning. And I can tell you, as a teacher, I sure didn't want violent kids in my classroom. One of my friends on the faculty got thrown down a staircase by one of my students. And I was actually called in as a character witness for the kid. And I said, look, the kid I've always gotten along with this kid, but you can't throw teachers down stairwells and stay in school. You can't do that. You can't have a school that operates when kids are coming in and attacking other people, including teachers. So, my own background is, you can't resolve everything with discussion. There are some things you just got to say, no, you can't do this here. And by the way, you and I are both parents, so we both put kids through school. So, we both, I have a parent's perspective as well as a teacher's perspective, and then a kind of outside observer's perspective. So there's in the essay I refer to this as a law and order approach, where you just set up rules and tell kids to follow them, and if they can't, you say, here are the disciplinary consequences. And bam, 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 maybe all the way up to expulsion. And that's how schools have always been run. And I hope you don't mind a historical digression, but the whole founding of US schools was based on the idea of assimilation. How can we get kids to, and this was in the mid 1800s when there were huge immigrant waves coming in primarily from Europe. And a man named Horace Mann said, we can't have this kind of cacophony of voices. We need to use schooling to create Americans. So we all speak the same language. We all salute the same flag. We all have a common knowledge base. This is you can recognize this in E.D. Hirsch and all these other lines of thought that have gone through American schooling. But the purpose was assimilation. And in fact, there's a teacher colleges where you learn to be a teacher were originally called normal schools. And they were called normal schools because normalization was what the teachers were supposed to do. They were to contribute and be part of this apparatus that socialized young people to establish norms and assimilate them into a way of being that from which they would emerge as people recognizable as Americans. Okay, and who had an American identity. And so you can already hear a lot of the debates about schooling being echoed in the whole purpose of establishment. But one of the vehicles, or the primary vehicle for promoting assimilation and these norms, was punishment. You screw up, you're out of here. You're not one of us. You're not normal. We can't have you here. And then you can also add layers. These schools were also designed for white people and mostly white males. And you can just go back and easily look through the record. The population getting public education was largely white. And when you think of 1850 or so as the establishment, the whole South was still, a slave society. They weren't going to schools, not with, or probably at all. In fact, they were prevented from reading. And again, these are problems that weren't confined to that era, but that have manifested themselves in subsequent generations in many ways. So one of the things I've written about in my scholarship is that this foundational goal of assimilation is in direct contrast to any kind of multicultural efforts, to broaden what is available to kids in school, broaden the kinds of things they read, broaden the ways that kids are allowed to talk and dress. It's all resting on this very this standardized approach to schooling, which is also evidenced in standardized testing. But these also come back to standardized forms of behavior. How do we make kids act right? And the law and order approach says the way you teach people to act right is to punish them when they don't. And that's always how schools have been operating. In fact, one of the points I made in the essay is that the Gwinnett County Schools actually have their own police force. So it's difficult to have police walking the halls, armed, I assume, and say, we're going to do restorative justice. Because the contradiction is so obvious to everybody. So that's one of the two main ways that people talk about getting kids to act well in schools, or to act appropriately, is punish aberrant behavior. And that's the way every school I ever taught in was run. No one was trying to rehab anybody. And I will confess something, even though I don't know what I think now. But back when I was a teacher, I had a very threatening student, clearly gang affiliated, was very menacing toward me. And I was very disappointed that his counselor in the school tried to talk him out of it and rehab him. And I said, man, I don't want this kid anywhere near me. This kid is dangerous. And there were gang issues in the school. And it was a kind of it wasn't quite zero tolerance, but I had a low tolerance for someone threatening me. And I had an equally low tolerance for a counselor who tried to social work him into being a better human being. So, going back in my own history, I'm part of, that's the system I grew up in. I understand why someone would take the view that trying to have conversation based, not so much rehabilitation, but guidance toward adopting a more moral stance in life is first of all, it's very labor intensive, and schools don't have enough personnel to do what they're supposed to do. And so but this is often,
in your case, that's after the fact.
well, it's supposedly after the fact and before the fact, because any of these ways of addressing aberrant behavior are designed to make behavior better in the future. And there's a school of thought that says punishment corrects behavior. And I can tell you that I slow my car down when I think I might get a ticket. There is a role for punishment in moderating how people act. The question is it the only way? And so these restorative programs, which I really want to believe in, are designed to create within the person a desire to behave in ways that are more that fit better with the people around them. And so that rather than it's less behavioristic, where you can smack the hand so the hand comes back. It's, why do you think you put your hand there? It's designed to be reflective, and I really want to believe that that is a great way, but I also know that it isn't always a great way. That there are sociopaths. There are people who are. I just watched this program on Jeffrey Dahmer. You couldn't counsel him out of being a serial killer and cannibal. The guy was a wreck. And so there are people who are really not well put together to conform to any way that society expects people to act.
And it seems to me that parents, if you don't mind me interrupting,
No, go ahead.
There's parents that dole out punishment and are abusive.
Absolutely.
And they may not even realize it. And then you have other parents who rarely, well, or at least in their minds, they rarely punish. And in both cases, maybe the child turns out okay. But the thing that's interesting to me, with a gigantic school system like this, you can't possibly parent every child, and that may be what you're getting at with the idea that you're becoming the parent, because of the code of you have to respect behavior as in all kinds of places. And so how are you, it seems to me, and in many cases you're doing a disservice if you don't have some standards.
Right. And the difference is, I think that the standards aren't terribly different between whether you think punishment or restorative justice is a better way. It's how you get there. I think the goal of both is socially acceptable behavior. But whether you learn to do that best by being smacked if you don't behave appropriately, or being counseled and engaged in conversations and reflection about your own behavior, which of those is the better approach is under dispute. And what I would say about most things is one size fits all never fits. And so there might be occasions when one's suitable and one's not, but those occasions also have to be situated within resources. And there are a number of problems with implementing restorative justice. One is that it takes a lot of time. So if I'm teaching a class and a kid throws a book at another kid or something, or gets up and get in a fist fight, let's make it more extreme. It's a lot easier for me to say, get out of my classroom and go to the discipline office, than it is for me to schedule 10 meetings with the kid and the counselor and his parents. Right? That's a lot of work. And there are as I understand it, and keep in mind, I'm not working in schools right now, but school violence is way up. Societal violence is way up. And I think that ignoring the pandemic and the easy availability of weapons ignores how these problems can really get rolling. But both out there in the streets and in the schools, there are increasing problems with poorly socialized people who haven't engaged with another person in a couple of years because of the shutdown. And so what then do you do about it? And this is where one of the terms you use was parents are saying, but one of the problems is that there are all kinds of parents out there, and the ones who get listened to look like you and me. They're white people. All this stuff that you hear from Youngkin in Virginia and DeSantis in Florida, parents' rights. There's a very specific kind of parent that they have in mind when they make that claim, and give that access. And they're the ones who are going to school board meetings and turning them into these chaotic battles. So you can't ignore the fact, I think, that discipline is meted out differently to white kids and Black and brown kids. And that is a form of injustice that in part feeds the desire to find different ways of undertaking discipline. Whether restorative justice is going to be a successful one in bypassing what are viewed as discriminatory disciplinary practices, or whether something else might be available is not yet clear. What strikes me as clear is that schools aren't resourced to implement them on much of a scale at all. And that people in schools don't necessarily buy into it. And again, this is a point I made in the article. You can't do that without buy-in. You can't get away from the thing you've always done, which is kid breaks the rules, kid gets punished, to a whole different disciplinary system. You can't just shock that into effect, especially in a mammoth county like Gwinnett, where all of the schools are very different from one another. The enrollments are different. And not everybody believes in that system anyhow. And what I suggested, I wasn't really taking sides. You can see I'm not really taking sides
You didn't.
in this argument. And because I don't know if I have one, I want to believe in restorative justice. One of my graduate students is actually doing my last doctoral student is doing her research in New York City on a restorative justice program, where it seems to be more part of the fabric of the school to think in that way. But it's not how Gwinnett County schools are built. Again, they've got armed police in the halls. That's hard to have restorative justice when the other thing you see is a guy with a gun who might shoot you if you act out. So what I proposed there was less, this one's right and this one's wrong, is if you want to try this one, don't impose it from the top, because then it's guaranteed not to work. Because you have to have a lot of training, you have to have complete buy-in. If someone who believes in punishment is tasked with running a counseling session, that's not going to be a very good one. So what you do, I think, and this is true with any intervention, and I recommended this. I was at a meeting, I won't name the politician, but one of the state politicians invited me to a meeting in the Dome a few years ago. And I think it was milestones or some gigantic new top-down imposition of an assessment system. And I said, don't do it all at once from the top. Pilot it. Try to find people who want to do it first, and see if the people who want to do it can do it. Because if they can't, nobody can. And then you're also not disrupting the whole system with almost guaranteed chaos. And of course that got ignored, and they went into whatever it was, they imposed it, and well, you can see how well these things work.
The thing I've noticed with looking at what happened in Gwinnett County, you have 5 board members, and they all voted for this policy. that was lowering the standard,
Well, it changed how the standard was addressed. I'm not, and
which in effect, I mean, that the outcome, the result is the standard behavior is much lower.
well, I think that they're trying. I see that I'm not sure about, because I think the goals are all.
I'm not saying this is what I think. I'm saying this is what they said. The board members.
Well, what
actually
parents say, right? What
Oh,
parents say.
board members that
Board
voted
members.
for the policy change are saying the policy, they're saying, this is what they're saying. The policy is a good policy. Not all of them are saying this, but we didn't implement the policy correctly.
I think that's true. That
Yes,
they didn't implement it well.
but my point is they had to know they weren't raising the standard of behavior. It could have only been lower.
Well, that you and I probably see that differently. I
I
think
mean,
that,
I know we're trying to get in someone else's mind, but it's just the concept that the things that you're saying are so true because of the size. So you have to assume that the baseline is acceptable. Does it make sense?
well, yes, but then I don't think that that's the disagreement. I think the disagreement is what you do when that violation occurs. Do you send the kid down to in-school suspension, or do you have these time-intensive conversations? But I think that the standard isn't very different, and the goal isn't very different, but the way to get there is completely different. And that's not to say that they both work equally well in getting you there. I'm not saying what works well. I'm saying what people want as the outcome
The
of
goals.
discipline policy.
The goals are the same.
I think so, to make schools safe and to get kids to internalize notions of appropriate behavior. And some people think that you internalize them through punishment, and you might refer to my not driving over the speed limit as a good example of that. Although, and I could harm people. There's death on the highway all the time from people driving too fast. So it's not just me and my car, it's me and the hazard that I might pose to other people that I'm looking over my shoulder to make sure that I don't engage in a violation. So I think that there is a role for discipline. But at the same time, I can guarantee you this. I've been pulled over by police officers. Not a lot. I mean, I don't drive like a maniac, but I have been, haven't we all? And they've always let me off with a warning. And that's not how Black people experience being pulled over by police. There's a ton of evidence of that. So how we get interpreted in how we respect rules and how we abide by rules can be very, very different just on the basis of how you look. And honestly, I can think of, well, 2 in the last 6 years, occasions when I had exchanges with police officers who just said, okay, well, don't do it again. Don't do it again. And then I've read about similar encounters with Black people where that is not what happened. In fact, some of these people got shot.
You're saying the standards, in your case, the standards were lower.
Well, much lower because of what I look like and the assumptions about people who look like you and me, as opposed to the assumptions made about people who have darker skin. And I don't want to racialize this too much, although I think that that's an inescapable issue.
Oh, it's definitely the politics of it, for sure.
Yeah.
What I saw was that, so one of the goals is for the folks that want to change this policy, which was it literally, I don't have it in front of me, but it isn't verbatim, but that school suspensions should be a last resort. So the idea that this is filtered through the administration and teachers, so that's why it seems to me when the board members voted for it, when you say that, you know that that would almost certainly be an uptick in violence and disruptions and that sort of thing. There's a group that put this out, some SPLC, this is just different political groups, Gwinnett, NAACP, and they say, and I know this is rhetoric, but it says disciplinary practice and policies that criminalize students or remove them from their classrooms do not make schools safe. And I think a lot of people on the other side of this argument would say, well, that's blatantly not true. So to your point, kind of talking past, the two sides are sort of talking past each other.
Yeah, they clearly are. And if you're asking me to resolve that, I can't. And it's, I think one of there's a problem that takes place in educational thinking that people who aren't actually in classrooms resolve all issues idealistically. In other words, well, punishment doesn't work, therefore we shouldn't punish because kids respond better to this, but then they don't all. And I'll give you an example of a teacher I know. I won't name the school or even the school district, but they're very lackadaisical about attendance, and there are kids kind of at large in the school. And as the teacher I talked to recently said, and it was just a few weeks ago, he said, you can always smell marijuana in the halls. And he said, kids come to my class, and the word he used was stupid stoned. In other words, they're so high. You know, they're who could teach such a person, right? Now, whether I don't know I don't know exactly what you do when the school doesn't have a sense of how to address that issue, and it's almost impossible to teach people who are so high that they could, and they're not violent, but they're not. You can't teach them, and having kids roam the hallways is you're just asking for trouble. And the school has had plenty of trouble from kids roaming the hallways, and they still just let it happen. So I wouldn't want to teach in a situation where there's no enforcement of attendance. Kids are roaming the halls, and half of them are high as a kite and can't be taught anything anyhow. So what do you do? And one kind of the simplest thing is to suspend them all. But then what do you do? And then what do the city police do when these kids are all roaming around, you know, the malls or the streets or wherever, doing whatever they're doing? And so the idea that you don't suspend kids assumes that if they're in class, they're there learning. I don't know if that's always the case. As I just said, if they're so high that they don't even know what class they're in, is that an improvement? But then suspending them, that's not a good solution either. This is just hard stuff. And people who oversimplify it by saying punishment is bad, we need restorative justice programs, end of story, and the people who say that doesn't teach them anything, throw them the hell out, end of story, that doesn't do anything either, because neither one recognizes the limitations of its own conception.
From
both of these are limited.
Right, but from the view of a parent, they have choice between, I live in this school district,
Yep,
where they have a high standard, and this other one where there's chaos. But the high standard has maybe the word is they're not proportionate with their discipline,
Right.
their punishment. So if individual parents are going to look at that and go, and I think this is cut and dry. Please tell me if I'm wrong. It doesn't matter what group I'm in. I'm going for the school with the high standards as a parent.
So my response to that is that certain kinds of parents have much better ability to mobilize their choices than others. We got housing projects here in Athens. They don't have a lot of choice. They can't just up and go to another school system. They're barely getting by where they are.
Oh, I'm just saying if you had to pick which school, if you had
Well,
the choice,
you
if
can't.
the parent had the choice, they're going to go.
And that is a choice that is accompanied by affluence, people who can move. I'm saying that poor people, they just can't up and.
Oh, I'm not saying they can move. I'm
Students
saying
living in
if.
Athens housing projects can't have their parents just say, this isn't working. I think I'm going to move to Lawrenceville. There's no place for them to go. They're living in public housing. They don't, they got minimum wage jobs.
I understand that, but I'm saying as a parent, if they had the choice between the school with a high standard and one that was chaos, they're going to go with the one with the high standard. That's not.
If they have the choice.
If they have the choice.
If they have mobility, if they have the affluence to relocate easily, that can happen. One thing that does then is leave the school of origin with only people with no mobility and fewer choices. But if you read the papers, you see people are homeschooling, people are electing independent schools, or as I sometimes call private schools. Some are moving to a new community. But those are consequences of certain inequities that enable some people to have those choices and some not to. And those are often structured from well outside those families.
Well, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but it kind of gets back to what the community will tolerate in terms of the behavior, whether you have young people on the streets or in the schools. It really, does it not come down to that? No matter what the route to get there, it's really comes down to what they're going to tolerate, right?
Well, when you say they, do you mean parents or teachers?
Parents specifically and society at large.
Well, I would say that parents aren't all the same. And, that one of the things when I hear parents, I tend to hear affluent white parents, often politically conservative white parents. They're the ones who are having all this influence. So I just think and I don't want to turn this to a discussion of race, but these factors to me are very present and impossible to ignore. But I also want to go back. If you look at the polling done in Atlanta during recent elections, what African American parents want is a safer city, right? There was a big law and order push in some of the most recent elections in electing Atlanta politicians. So it's not just white people complaining about these things. Black people don't like getting shot, and they don't like unsafe streets, and they don't like unsafe schools. There's no doubt about that. They're not listened to as much. So I think that when society at large is violent, schools become more violent, and nobody has a good solution. And this is where we come up with the kind of the polarized perspectives right now in Gwinnett, which is the impetus for our conversation, is this law and order versus restorative justice clash. And my solution is not one or the other, but if you're going to do restorative justice, you do it in a very, you build it, you don't impose it all at once from the top.
Well, and that's another reason that I wanted to talk with you, because there was a work session, I think it was on the 17th. One of the administrators was being asked by the board about this particular thing, and the response was, there is no way, it was all or nothing. There's no way we could have done a pilot or a test. What do you think about that?
I think that's wrong. I think that's the only way you do it. Anytime you make wholesale change, you don't dump it from the top onto people who aren't prepared to put it into practice and who might not believe in it. If I were an administrator, and I am not, I would find people who felt that this was a good thing to do and start it there in a pocket, not school-wide, where plenty of people would not believe in the system. And I think that you have to demonstrate it, especially if it's new and different. It needs to have a track record before other people will buy into it. And I know there's restorative justice has been around in some form for many years. In fact, this whole idea that punishment is bad is quite an old one in Europe. If you read about European education, it goes back many years, that punishment doesn't teach people doesn't change what's within. And that's what we really should be striving for, is these fundamental internal developmental changes toward a more a better citizen, which I think is what we all want out of this. We want good citizens. Although lately the definition of that is up for grabs. But we're trying to build people who believe in their nation. And I'm a critic of my nation, but I still believe in it. And this is where I'm different from some people who call themselves patriotic, as I think that a good place can be better. And I think that the U.S. is a place with a lot right and a lot wrong about it, but it's still my place, And I'll move along from that. But how do we instill in young people a sense that some sort of national ethos has value, even as we invite people to rely on knowledge from other cultures? And so we have, of course, anybody could say, well, a lot of immigrants here in this country, aren't we mostly all? And we all had to go through these adjustments. Why can't we incorporate? But say when my grandparents came over from Belarus, they were part of the World War I exodus. They were Jewish, and they came here in order to assimilate. But that's also a very Jewish thing, because they've been nomadic for their whole existence. That one thing Jewish people are good at is fitting into niches, because they've always had to. And but that's not how, that was 100 years ago. And so the modern immigrant is being much more encouraged to retain aspects of their cultures of origin. And to me, that's a good thing, because I'm enriched by learning about how things are seen from other people's point of view. Now, that's not how everybody sees it, though. And Edward, Bill, I'm a little worried I'm drifting off our topic of discipline in Gwinnett schools, but the whole multicultural ethos suggests that there's more than one way to be a good citizen and more than one way to behave appropriately in school. And so if your Mayor Lindsay of New York said in, I think, the 60s, that dissent is patriotic. And that's actually become the catchphrase of the ACLU, dissent is patriotic. To some people, dissent is not patriotic at all. It means you're bad. So there are different ways, there are just different ways of understanding what it means to act appropriately and to be a good citizen and grow into a culture as a productive contributing member that might be disruptive, but in the end is for the good of the system. And I guess I fit myself into that category of being disruptive when I need to be. But none of that solves this very fundamental problem. Here I'm speaking very idealistic. You get down to the nitty gritty. I don't want my teacher friends getting punched out by kids, right? I don't want them to have to teach classes of stoned kids who don't even know what planet they're on. I don't want fist fights breaking out in hallways or kids bringing guns and knives to school, So but if you ask me, what do I do about it? When I look at the alternatives, what I can say is probably none of them are going to work that well.
My experience was in fairly small high school. And it was almost entirely black and white. There wasn't any other ethnicities, such as Asian or something. And the code of conduct was, you didn't, if there was fighting, because we're kids fight. Teachers didn't see the fights. They were done out of sight. And it rarely happened. And if you were caught fighting, you were punished. And if you were to ever speak out in a class and, God forbid, threaten a teacher, you'd probably get expelled. It was a pretty high. That was my memory. It was a pretty high standard. And honestly, Peter, everybody turned out pretty good. I mean, and there's all kinds of different income levels also. In fact, everybody was kind of on the low end, to be honest with you. I mean, there weren't a lot of wealthy people in my town. And so I have a hard time with the idea that yes, parents are all of all levels are differently, but that parents have a responsibility, and you can't abuse a child or neglect a child. And it just seems to me that when I hear, and I want your perspective on this, because the reason I go through this is just say, okay, well, you have teenagers are the ones that they're larger, and middle schoolers, they're larger. They can hurt people.
Yeah.
They didn't get to a high school as falling into this category that they're either unteachable or because of their behavior, or they're acting out violently. So it seems to me that they weren't corrected in school early enough. That's just what it seems to me.
Well, and that's actually the rationale of much of the punitive systems is you correct it now and you won't have the problem later, which may or may not be the case. But to go back, you said that this was a relatively small school, right?
Yes.
So I still think back, when I was at the University of Oklahoma, I would visit very small schools, graduating classes of 20. Oklahoma has a zillion. It was a bit
larger than that, but yeah, it was about 100.
Of graduating classes of 100?
Yes.
Okay. So, I was talking to the principal, and this was an agricultural community. It was down in it was surrounded by cotton farms, and so no one was rich. There were but everybody was white. And I said to the principal, I said, this seems like a very nice school. It felt, it had a good feel to it. And he said, well, I'll tell you this. He said, I know every kid in this school, and I know where they're supposed to be all the time, because there weren't, there weren't a whole lot of them. So if I'm out there, I say little Johnny over here, and I say, aren't you supposed to be in math class? Oops. So there was actually kind of a surveillance system but it was applied in a fairly gentle way. Aren't you supposed to be? someplace else, yeah, oops, yeah, I'm going there. But I think a school where the graduating classes are 20 or 25 kids and Gwinnett County are worlds apart and don't call for the same approach. And again, I don't, what were you talking about, the school you attended?
Pardon me?
Or were you speaking of the school that you attended that
Yes.
had 400? Okay.
Yes.
Was that in Georgia?
Yes.
Okay. You don't need to name it. But that's, I think smaller systems just work better than bigger systems.
Parents have more control, no question, also.
Well, for good or ill. I'm probably less of a parents are always right type.
Well, I'm not saying parents are always right, but they have input. And a school system the size of Gwinnett County, I mean, a small, I mean, you can have a large group of parents that aren't paid much attention to because it
Right.
gets political. Smaller systems are
it's
less
always
political.
political.
That's what I was
School
getting at.
systems
Smaller systems are less political, so generally.
Well, but they could also be, it's like a lot of small things. The quality of the leader really matters a lot then, because if it's a dictatorial type in a small setting, everybody's miserable. If it's a benevolent leader, then everything will work. People will have greater job satisfaction. Let's put it that way. Yeah, I think more in terms of how, not so much what parents want, but how you can make teaching a desirable profession, which it is not right now. And in part because parents come in making conflicting demands. And kids are actually kids have more power in schools, I think, than teachers, because kids can get their parents to manipulate the administration to work against teachers. It happens. And the last people anybody listens to are teachers right now. As I said, students have more voice, I think, in how things work to their advantage.
From that same point, with teachers, I'm curious to see what you think about this, because most teachers that I've met in my life, they want to teach.
Yep.
They don't want to act as psychologists or as therapists. They want to teach. They want to show up, do their work, and if they can be a positive influence by, mentoring or a kid, maybe mentor is not the right word in its context, what I'm thinking, but if they can be a positive influence by displaying empathy, for example, that, they're happy to do that, of course, but to spend an inordinate amount of time to try to teach a child empathy, that's one of the things that that's one of the concepts,
right.
I think, correct?
Mm-hmm.
That's not, tell me if I'm wrong, but many of them would think of this as a fool's errand. Is that not true?
What, the teaching empathy is a fool's errand?
No, that if they're spending an inordinate amount of time trying to be a therapist instead of teaching, that they would think the act of acting as a therapist with a student that's emotionally troubled for some reason is because that's not their training.
Well, I would underscore it's not their training about 100 times. And I actually taught in an English department that had some practicing therapists in it, and there was this therapeutic mindset on the faculty that I felt very uncomfortable with, because I had no such training and didn't want to be a therapist. Even though the kids did a lot of reflective and personal writing, the English curriculum can lend itself to all sorts of explorations of themes, life themes, one of which might be empathy. So the curriculum, I wanted the curriculum to do the work, not me to be somebody's counselor. And I know people at the university level who have no training as a therapist, who believe that they are therapists. And I find that to be unprofessional and downright criminal sometimes. So
Yeah,
ahead.
that's one of the issues with, I think with, sorry to interrupt, but that's one of the issues that I see with the concepts of restorative justice, social emotional learning is you're asking teachers to do something that they don't have the training for, they're not, anyway.
Well, and that's if you read the stories, and actually there's another, I don't know when the last time you checked the paper, but there's another piece that Maureen Downey for the AJC Get Schooled blog that just came out early this afternoon that tries to kind of drop back and not so much take sides, but look at why this discussion in Gwinnett County is taking place, why this conflict is taking place. And I think implementation is a big problem, the fact of how they did it. And another of the issues that she wrote about concerned the massive amount of training needed to do this well that hasn't been done. You know, I'm thinking the way Vladimir Putin has started taking conscripts and sending them to the front line a week later. It doesn't work.
Right.
You got to be trained to do these.
Yeah.
And you have to believe in it.
Yeah. That's one of the, I can just picture a lot of teachers saying, you're asking me to do something that if you have a, anyone, student or whoever is really emotionally troubled, they really need a lot more attention than an English teacher could give them, for example, in my opinion.
Yeah, well, that depends on the English teacher. Some are, all they want to do is teach grammar. Some all they want to do is cultivate kids' potential in life. A lot of you can't walk into any English department and find any 10 people who have the exact same views. So they all interpret their job differently. And I was on much larger faculties in the 20 to 30 range. There's just a lot of diversity in what we thought was good English teaching. Methodologically, in terms of the topics and the texts that you select, it's just
right.
not.
And you're teaching English, not spending an inordinate amount of time one-on-one counseling or that sort of group counseling or however this is going to.
No, you don't have time for that. Especially
right.
An English teacher has 2 papers to grade to also participate in these group therapy sessions, although the restorative justice practice or approach requires it. And I don't think that schools would have to be so much better funded. And to broaden this a little bit, there were also articles in the paper this afternoon about the crisis in youth mental health, including suicide rates, depression, and anxiety. That was the feature of this one. Those, you can't just say, well, tough luck, kid, because they might kill themselves. And they do kill themselves. Suicide rates are alarming among teenagers. So which problem do you address first? Because they're often mental health is blamed for some of the outbursts that you have in school. That the problem isn't one that you can reason the kid out of, that there is something imbalanced internally. But there's also disagreement on whether that's what causes these outbursts or these frames of mind. Is it chemical or is it social? Or is it both? Usually it's both and not one or the other. But if you're putting all this attention into the disciplinary part and all these resources and all this human labor that you're requiring of teachers, you're not doing this other work, because that takes resources and time and money too. And that I really read about it. I think this was in the Washington Post this afternoon. It's just not happening. And so then you take a kid who's psychotic and is punishment the best thing for that kid? So I have friends who had a son who had very, very deep deep psychological problems to the point where his parents were afraid of him. And he was acting out violently. He got arrested. He was driving around. In fact, the way I learned of this, I read about this in the newspaper. Illinois kid, and I won't use the correct name. Because his family doesn't need this attention. But I read in the paper, we'll just say Billy Johnson, well, a more unique name than that, was driving around, and he's 30 years old. He had a pile of rocks next to him, and he was just driving around throwing them into other cars. Hard. And got arrested. And I thought, God, that sounds like my pal's kid. And I wrote him, I said, is this your son? He said, yeah, that's him. And I read the story here in Georgia. This happened back in Chicago. And one of the things they said was, this kid he's bipolar. We adopted him. What's this? There's this, I forget what it's called. It's when you don't get picked up as a baby, you have these alienation issues. And the kid was in a hospital in South America, and no one picked him up for 2 years. And he had all sorts of psychological problems. And what they said was, sending him to jail isn't going to help anybody. This kid needs attention. This kid needs a lot more than we can provide him.
Resources.
But, resources and knowledge, and you're working with your own kids is
multiple types of resources, but
he needed more, but sending him to jail wasn't what was best, they felt. And so this is, I think, the sort of problem that is also implicated in these school issues. What do you do, especially if kids aren't responsive to these kinder interventions, these more with efforts that are based in understanding? I don't know what to do. Honestly, I don't know what to do. There's a story I've told a few times. When I was a high school teacher, and this was in actually a fairly affluent community, one of my students after school went down to the local duck pond and slaughtered the swans, killed them all. And I can tell you, at that time, and I was probably in my late 20s, my response was, what a jerk. It wasn't, what's wrong? What can we do for this kid? It wasn't, let's have some conversations with it. It was just, I just utterly dismissed the kid as a complete, jerk, loser, criminal, whatever you want to do it. And I say this to acknowledge my own development in my thinking, because I'm not sure that would be my response now. It was when I was young and far less sophisticated in my thinking, kind of cut and dried. You're a good guy or a bad guy. You're a jerk or you're okay. And that's how I've been taught to think. You have character or you don't. And I think that there's a lot more knowledge we have now about how people are made up and the sorts of experiences that contribute to that would give me a different perspective on that student. And this, and the crime was committed off campus. So that, and I think that schools are having all sorts of issues dealing with cyber issues that take place out in school. Do you suspend someone who bullies a kid in the evening from home? And that is a question that educators are having to ask themselves now. How do we manage this? Because it comes back into the building.
Right.
And sometimes the kid who gets bullied comes in and acts out. So who do you punish?
Right.
I don't know.
You
bring it into mediation? You bring the two parties into mediation and hope it works?
Well, I appreciate you taking the time and being so candid with your thoughts, because most people often say, I don't know. But but if you don't mind me sort of, if you want to add anything to this, in the case of specifically the Gwinnett County situation, you had a school board that definitely changed the policy, the behavior has absolutely upticked. You see a lot of teachers on video criticizing, saying they actually think restorative justice is a good thing, but the situation you have now is untenable. It's not working for anyone. So you have the school board that made this decision. They are not going back. They're not going to go backwards. It seems to me, I'm curious to see if you agree with this, but I predict they're going to make some progress on better behavior, maybe through the rest of the school year, but where they were, they're taking a big risk that they're normalizing for a lot of students that are nonviolent, non-disruptive. They're normalizing this idea that that's the environment that they're going to have to go to school in for a long time.
And I'm not in the school, so I don't have any empirical knowledge of.
I'm just going by what the board says.
Well, boards tend to say what keeps boards on boards. And don't we all? But so I'm not in those schools. I can't tell you whether the kids are tearing them apart or not. There are data that show that there are far more disruptions following COVID. But I also think that let's try to look at this.
What I was, if you don't mind.
Well, hold on, let me try that.
Sure.
So there's a problem that schools are experiencing greater behavioral disruptions now than they were in the first half of 2020. I think there's no doubt about that. And outside school, there is the same problem. There's far greater violence than there was in the well, I guess we'd have to go back to 2019. That is the problem. I don't see how a new restorative justice program could be responsible for it, because it's a response to the problem, not the cause of the problem. There's something else causing this problem, and it has to do with the uptick in violence, broadly speaking, through the panic and the crisis mindset of us all having our lives threatened by this illness. And it's caused a lot of desperation, and kids being home from school have been desocialized from how to behave in a public institution. That, to me, if we can't agree on that, then there's nothing to talk about. But so it wasn't caused by a new program. I don't see how something that happened a couple of years ago can be caused by something that's happening now. Time doesn't work that way. It doesn't go backwards. So if I don't see restorative justice as being the reason people are acting out, it may be a reason that the acting out isn't being moderated the way they want. But it's not clear that punishment would moderate it either, because I just don't know. I'm not saying any way to argue this point empirically and convincingly, because I'm still not sure what the effects of these different programs are. I think the problem that is being articulated by, say, teachers and angry parents is that the way kids are acting out seems to be coddled by efforts to teach them how to negotiate their way through conflict. Now, whether that's true or not, I don't know. I have friends who do restorative justice, and I respect them. They're intelligent people. They're very thoughtful. They care. They often have the concerns of minoritized students at heart. And so there are people who I respect who believe in restorative justice, which doesn't mean that you can just plop it in and make it work.
Well, I'm getting this from the board and administration. They've reported a big jump in all kinds of incidents. The one that really sticks out is probably 30% more fights or something.
A lot more fights. There's no doubt about that. But
And
I don't think that that's caused by the intervention. I don't think that it's caused by restorative justice. I think restorative justice is trying to address it, because when the problem started several years ago, you can't blame the current new intervention for it.
well, I think what a lot of teachers are saying, that have spoken out, and the administration as well are saying, we're using suspensions as a last resort, where we would suspend kids for this, so we would have less fighting if we use this punishment. But at any rate,
Well, but they may be right. I mean, I'm not denying that might be right.
Well, it's against your thoughts that they shouldn't have done this top-down approach and not pilot, is what my point was.
Right. No, and that's what if you and I agree on that, then we've made a lot of progress, that you don't start a massive program that's the opposite of what you always have done and expect it to work. There's a body of work that's about 30 years old now that concerns the inevitable failure of school reform. And there's a man named Seymour Saracen who was who did a lot of that writing. And one of the reasons that school reforms almost always fail is that the people who envision them never envision the problems. They only envision the rosy outcomes. And that's what they base everything on, is the wonderful foolproof effects of their great intervention. And nothing works like that. And so school reform tends to be undertaken so idealistically. And I think this is true of restorative justice also, that it overlooks how hard it is. Systemic change is really hard to accomplish, especially when it's the opposite of what has been done since the founding of schools, which is to standardize, assimilate, and normalize everyone according to the values of the people who set it up. And these were all white men. And white men have been running schools forever. And I'm a white man. We're okay, but we also aren't anybody else, and so don't know what the world necessarily looks like from another point of view.
Well, I never really thought about it that way that much, but anyway, I appreciate you going over this. It's been very informative.
Well, I enjoy talking about it, and I'm glad that we can kind of reach the understandings that are available to us. And I think anyone who comes out of this with a hard and fast opinion that allows for no disagreement is not paying attention. It's just too hard. It's too complicated. Society has never figured out how to deal with violators. I remember when I bet I was in about 5th grade, my older sister did a paper on prison reform. A little, junior high or maybe high school thesis paper. And she made the case that prison should be rehabilitative, not punitive. And this is in the mid-60s. And I remember thinking, really? You're not supposed to I thought that's what you went to prison for. Was to get punished. I was probably 10, 12 years old or something. And so these are not new disagreements. And she didn't make that issue up. She learned about it, that there are actually differences in how prisons are believed to operate. Should we rehab, or should we punish the hell out of people so that they never want to do this again, or at least get punished for what they did? And we know that recidivism from following prison release suggests that it's not working. right? That's not how punishment necessarily works.
Say that again, following recidivism.
Well, so people become recidivists, people who get released from prison after having been punished.
Right.
Not all of them, but many of them are back in prison. So the punishment hasn't been, they haven't internalized the lessons that punishment is designed to teach them. And that's probably how school discipline works too, is that you might punish them, but do they become, does it change how they see the world? Probably not.
And then you're weighing the balance of whether to protect the many.
The
interest of the many.
That's right. And it's also not clear if restorative justice provides these fundamental developmental changes in people's worldviews to make them more empathic and relationship driven people. I would love it if that happened. I wish it did. But what I'm saying is both of these conceptions are flawed. Punishment's definitely problematic, and so is the results coming in from the early restorative justice effort haven't been favorable in Gwinnett County. Now, that's not to say they haven't been effective anywhere, because I believe there are places where they have, and there are books on this by people I know and these are people I have a high regard for. So, we're probably back to where we started, which is we have the same problem. There are these fundamentally different understandings of what it takes to make a person a productive and solid citizen. Do we kind of nurture them, or do we hammer them? The jury's out on both, and both are problematic. And neither one takes into account things like mental health. Maybe restorative justice would.
Well,
just because it tries to drill quite a bit deeper into the problem instead of just looking at the surface of it.
I've probably taken up too much of your time, but I just had a thought about. This is what I think about that, is that if you, and I probably didn't express myself well because I thought I might have mentioned this earlier, is that if you have someone with a serious mental health issue, or you suspect, and you're a teacher, it seems to me that the important thing is that you refer as best
you're supposed to,
as best as your sources, whatever the environment is. But that's not the training of a teacher, and teachers don't. It's a serious issue when somebody's has a serious mental, or they suspect they have a serious mental health problem. It's not going to be solved could do more harm than good, actually. And
that, no doubt. And teachers, I can tell you that there might be in special education courses some attention to that, but I sure wasn't trained for it. And when I started teaching, but that was the 70s. But
practice.
Well, it's handled through in-servicing probably, or a handout at the beginning of the year, if usually blah blah blah. But that doesn't mean trained diagnosticians get diagnoses wrong. I can guarantee you that. I know.
Oh, no question.
Experience. And so, is your average math teacher qualified to do that? Nothing against math teachers, but I always heard, well, you're an English teacher, you have a better insight into psychology because literature is highly psychological. Well, I didn't know anything about how to do that, and I'm pretty confident most people don't. I'll give an anecdote, and this is from a counselor, and I'm going to anonymize things. Parent brought kid in for an IEP meeting. Kid was autistic and had other mental health issues. Counselor said, well, you need to hold her feet to the fire. The parent said, well, if I wanted her to kill herself, I would. Because that wasn't what was going to work there. And so here's a counselor completely ignoring suicide rates, mental health issues, even with an IEP written for them. Had no idea of how to, it was all, you hold their feet to the fire, you punish them. And nope, that there are kids who kill themselves over that.
Right. And well, we covered a lot of things, and I really appreciate you doing this. I've taken up enough of your time. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
Well, only my appreciation for your interest and time, and I think it's very productive that we don't agree on everything, because that then highlights what we need to work on. And as I've been saying all along, I don't have the answers. I won't find them if I don't engage with other people. And the importance, what's absent, I think, in the discussion in Gwinnett County is listening. People are just coming in and reinforcing their own prior opinions, and that doesn't advance anything. And they're also not paying attention to all the evidence, no matter which position they're taking. They're ignoring evidence that suggests that maybe their own perspective needs a little work, just as mine always does and always will.
Well, thank you for doing this.
Right.
Peter Smargorinsky, sorry,
Thanks.
with me. And this is Bill Griffin, Different Take Podcast. I really appreciate you watching. If you like this content, please subscribe, like, share, comment. Thank you.